Hello and welcome to the PDA Society's podcast. We're here to chat about all things PDA to help you understand what people with this profile of autism are experiencing and how you can help. We'll be sharing research, professional expertise and the insights of people with lived experience to help you understand PDA and have more tools to make life easier. So, whether you're a PDA yourself, a family member, friend or professional trying to make a difference, welcome from everybody at the PDA Society. We hope you'll find this useful. Before we begin, I do need to warn listeners that we will be discussing themes, things like distressed behaviours that may cover self-injury and violence, and also the fact that many PDAs can be misunderstood and some of the injustice that can bring. So please do look after yourself and step away if you need to. So hello everybody and welcome to today's podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Rachel Worthington, who is an HCPC registered forensic psychologist and a full member of the Division of Forensic Psychology, including holding Associate Fellow status. She's also a chartered scientist and is a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. So thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today. Would you like to say a few words about the purpose of what we're hoping to achieve during today's podcast?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. So today I'm hoping that we'll be able to discuss the findings of two pieces of research that we did looking at autistic pathological demand avoidance, that people's experiences in the criminal justice system, and make some recommendations for how people might be supported in those settings.
Lovely. So what was it in the first place that really motivated you to carry out this piece of research?
So I've worked with autistic clients for many years. I trained as a forensic psychologist around about 20 years ago, and I've worked with clients with a range of different difficulties, but particularly more recently in my career, I worked with autistic individuals, and really looking at how that might present in terms of aggression in forensic settings. So I undertook some sort of work with clients. I saw some of the differences perhaps that some of those clients might present with, and I trained some forensic psychologists at the Division of Forensic Psychology in pathological demand avoidance to help them to understand how that might present in around about 2021. But I'd also, as part of my PhD, which is like a doctorate, that's why I'm a doctor of psychology, I'd done work with staff as well in forensic settings. So I suppose I was conscious of both the ways in which individuals present, but also the ways that staff might struggle to understand some of the functions of people's behaviour and what that might feel like for them. So as part of the work that I'd done, I'd written some book chapters and articles on understanding aggression through an autistic lens, as well as considering family members and carers that surround those individuals as well. So I think those things are really, really important. And I was really fortunate to be approached by the PDA Society, who were doing some training at the time about how they might support people with PDA in forensic settings. And I was really keen to be involved and hope that the combination of that sort of practitioner psychologist, as well as my academic experience, might be able to provide a lens, I suppose, through which people's voices could be heard and understood, so that we could really think about the ways that people might be supported. I suppose I'm conscious that there's evidence that suggests autistic individuals might face a range of barriers to effective participation in the criminal justice system, but there's a need generally to establish what some of those barriers are generally for autistic defendants and people accused in those systems. But there were no studies at all looking specifically about what that might be for within the context of autistic individuals with PDA. So I felt hopefully that some of my experience and some of that knowledge might be able to provide, like I said, a lens through which we could hear people's experiences and think about how they could be supported in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things about PDA is that, okay, it's a profile on the autism spectrum, but you and I know, and families that we support at the society know that the classic autism strategies just make things worse for PDA. So, I'm sure for families, this will be, some research that they're so interested in. So, can we start off talking about the study design, sort of the number of people that you interviewed, sort of thing?
Yes, of course. So there were two studies. The first study, we conducted interviews with 18 individuals. Just to be clear, all the individuals that we interviewed had a diagnosis of autism as well as PDA additional features. So I know that there can be difficulties, I suppose, in terms of historical perceptions around PDA and the diagnostic categories and those things. But just so that listeners are clear, all of the participants in our study had a diagnosis of autism, and they also had PDA features as well. So there were 18 individuals that took part. That was a combination of people who'd been involved in the criminal justice system themselves, as well as maybe their family members or their children who were obviously unable to participate due to their difficulties. But the study related to 21 individuals, as sometimes the parent might have also had autism and PDA as well as their child. So there were 21 people that our study related to. As I said, they all had a formal diagnosis of autism. They were that related to 14 males and 7 females, and they'd had contact with the criminal justice system in terms of things like prison, secure forensic hospitals, courts, the youth justice system, and the police. So the study was advertised on social media, as well as the PDA Society website, and people took part in based on those sort of interviews. The interviews, we were very lucky. The participants really gave us very rich experiences, very, very in-depth interviews, and the interviews ranged from sort of an hour to over an hour and a half, sometimes nearly 2 hours. So, and we were really grateful that people provided their time for us to hear their voice. The second study was 32 participants who'd worked in the criminal justice system. This was advertised via an online survey where people filled in the questionnaires online. So this was slightly different. It wasn't interviews with people, it was anonymous questionnaires online. And the reason for that was to improve people's potential capacity to participate. And we know that it's difficult for people involved in the criminal justice system to have the time for interviews, but also to get organisational consent to participate in things like that. So sometimes anonymity can be easier for accessing professionals sort of in those systems. So like I said, that was 32 participants, which is a good sample size for the type of analysis that we did, which was thematic analysis, looking at the themes across both studies. But obviously 32 is quite limited in terms of the number of people working in the criminal justice system as a whole. So it's worth bearing in mind that it's a nice sample size for this type of analysis that we've done, but it is constrained in that sense. And I think it's always important before we present the findings to just be really honest about some of the constraints of research. Sometimes we only present those at the end, and then people might not hold that in mind as they're hearing the findings. So I always try to bear those in mind at the beginning and remind people. So as I said, there were the number of criminal justice professionals was in the study was quite small in comparison to those that work in it as a whole. And obviously we have to remember that obviously the study was advertised on the PDA Society platforms, and that might have biased some of the responses from participants who already had some knowledge about PDA. But also we need to bear in mind that the participants with autism and PDA are obviously self-selected as well, and their experiences obviously very valuable, and that is their voice and that's their lived experience. But there might be other people who've had different experiences that didn't participate in the study. So we need to hold that in mind, I suppose, when we're generalizing findings, to just kind of bear that in mind, that sometimes people who choose to participate in studies sometimes have more of the extreme views, I suppose, or extreme experiences in terms, and that's why they're keen to have their voices heard. So we were very lucky to hear those voices, and it's just worth bearing in mind that other people may have had different experiences.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks for that transparency. So you mentioned that you got lots and lots of rich data. How did you analyze all that data afterwards, after the interviews?
So we use what's called thematic analysis, and that's a method of really analysing what we call qualitative research, so not questionnaires, really thinking about the types of themes that come together, the common things that you might hear across participants that tell a story about their sort of lived experiences. So that's how we followed the kind of process for that. There's a particular way of doing that, and it's a kind of 6-stage process where you really become familiar with the data, really listen to the stories that people are telling you, and then begin to think of kind of what are the common themes that perhaps come from people's experiences to be able to explain their story.
Mhm. Okay. And then this is the bit I'm excited about. What were your findings?
Okay, so the aims of our study were quite a few, I suppose. The first one was to think about in what way PDA might contribute towards being at risk of being involved in the criminal justice system in the first place, and we found there were 6 themes that came from that question. The first one related to differences in the way that autistic people with PDA presented, and what we found was that resulted in them being not being believed by professionals that they were autistic, and we found that that disbelief contributed towards an exacerbation of their difficulties, and really that was because professionals responded with an increased control rather than compassion. So participants really described how they've been openly told by people you're not autistic. Like I said, even though all of them had a diagnosis of autism, and that was formally diagnosed by NHS professionals. And they talked about how part of the difficulty was the kind of stereotypes, I suppose, about how people thought autism may present. And they talked a lot about, obviously, we've been really lucky that organisations like the National Autistic Society have done a wonderful pieces of work highlighting people's awareness of autism and some of the difficulties that presents for people. But the participants in this study felt that perhaps the PDA sort of profile meant that the symptoms presented in quite a different way. They talked about how they were told that they didn't have autism because they had normal eye contact and or lots of friends. And one of the ways that they talked about they presented was with this sort of adopting more sophisticated strategies to try and avoid these fear demands, having this sort of Einstein intelligence, I think was one of the phrase one of them used, and this ability to really read a room, and using this sort of learned strategies to be able to look in a room and spot everything. But the function of that was about being able to spot anything that might be a perceived threat. But that because of those difficulties, that sometimes meant that professionals didn't believe that perhaps that person had autism. And instead, the person might try and use really sophisticated strategies to avoid demands, reading the room, try and mirror things that other people do when they don't want to do something, perhaps being friendly or using humor or flattery. But these were sort of really learned strategies the person had used, and attempts to kind of mask some of their difficulties. But the way this was received by professionals was that they could be manipulative, or that they were sort of using, sometimes they might use intellectual challenge to kind of burrow down on an argument, that perhaps they might use flattery to avoid a demand, and if that didn't work they might use intellectual challenge to kind of burrow down on an argument, as somebody said. And because of those more intricate kind of skills that that person might use, professionals are often felt that as a result they didn't believe that the person was autistic, and instead they use words like manipulative to describe them. And because they perceived them in that way, this often led them to professionals adopting a more kind of increased demands upon the person, a lack of empathy or compassion. They weren't connecting with the difficulties that that person was experiencing, and instead they adopted a more controlling response, to sort of demand that the person should do what they were asking. And this meant that these sort of demands then kind of escalated, and that it resulted in increased involvement in the criminal justice system. So that sort of reciprocal role was something that we saw in the first theme. The second theme we saw is that when this sort of intense terror was paired then with being sort of forced to engage in a demand, this resulted in much more severe physiological sort of fight or flight responses, which then escalated the likelihood of an involvement with the criminal justice system. So one of the things that participants talked about is they might start by using humour or flattery or more socially skilled social skills to avoid demands. When those weren't successful, intellectual challenge might kick in. And when that wasn't successful, that's when the person became to feel a real sense of terror. And what they described is that at that point, their kind of moral compass might sort of shut down, so that the person might become violent towards people that they liked, as well as people they might not like, family members, people that were close to them. But it was about that absolute fear and desperation, to the point that, and what they described as it being physically palpable, so that you could physiologically see that person's terror in their body. And they gave examples of, how really young children, often sometimes primary school age, might present with this physical energy that terrified sometimes criminal justice system professionals, perhaps police wishing to taser them because they were so terrified. And you've asked then numbers of criminal justice system people kind of feeling that they needed backup, I suppose, because the extent at which this physiological terror was presenting could really frighten them. And they described that as being almost more like a rampage from the individual. And obviously, when the criminal justice system person with them was terrified as well, they then attempted to exert even more control in a kind of escalation to that response. So what people talked about is very quickly this kind of situation could escalate incredibly quickly because of that level of terror. And then suddenly lots of people would be involved. Lots of people would be then telling that person what to do. And then that individual might try to run away. They'd have absolute desperate just sort of need to escape the situation. They might, for example, run into cars. And then suddenly you've got the police, the ambulance and the fire brigade involved. So they described how things could suddenly escalate very, very quickly because of the intense way in which this physiological sort of response was really palpable. The third thing we found was that participants said how much they kind of struggled with masking, and when that was heightened with morality and loyalty, what we found was that they found it difficult to perform in the criminal justice system as people expected them to or wanted them to. And then the response they got from criminal justice system people was almost worse as a result. So, for example, they described how they might have a heightened sense of social justice and moral rules, that actually moral compass was quite high in participants. And that would often result in them questioning things they were told, and they felt that people should sort of earn respect rather than just kind of assume it. Well, obviously in the criminal justice system, police, judges, people like that kind of are used to, I suppose, holding a certain level of respect. But from these participants, what they described was that they wouldn't respond with this kind of automatic obedience to authority. People can't tell me what to do, that you have to sort of earn respect. What this resulted in was that sometimes this sort of this had a detrimental effect on them, because not only would they question what they were being told to do, they wouldn't mask their inner feelings at the same time. So, for example, they might go into court and tell a judge exactly what they thought, and the kind of autistic inability to mask those inner experiences meant they didn't perform as perhaps a judge would want them to in a court setting. So where other people in that kind of setting might tell the judge what they want to hear, even if they don't really believe it, or because they think, well, I don't really want to, I don't want to go down for as long. What we found with these participants was that they wouldn't perform in that way. They would still be blunt in their communication style. And to some extent, that honesty was also about not being controlled. That was about not having authority telling the individual what to do. But as a consequence of that, that often meant that judges and professionals in those systems would often feel quite angry and would get this kind of irritation that the individual wasn't kind of bowing to their authority, which perhaps they were used to, or felt that individual should. And often then that resulted in a kind of sort of jostling for control, or heightened irritation in the professional, telling the person more what to do. And so then they sort of they might get additional sentence lengths or more kind of harsh punishment because they wouldn't kind of bow to that authority in that setting. The fourth thing we found was that participants described how, because they didn't act in a typically autistic way, schools didn't often know how to support them, and that led to them feeling that no one understood them. They would often be rejected from school, one school to the next, without any suitable support. And participants described how that left them feeling frightened, traumatized, that no one would care for them. And they often then responded kind of through those behaviours at a younger age than their kind of typically developing peers. So what they described in this one was that schools often had a place where they could support young people who presented with kind of the autistic typical sort of profiles. So people presented with more typical autistic profiles, then they seemed to have a kind of place or a way to support them. But these individuals who were more seemingly socially skilled and socially perceptive in order to avoid demands on them were often misunderstood in these settings, and they felt that they were labelled as being bad rather than being anxious or frightened. And they felt that this kind of lack of understanding led to difficulties not only in terms of delays of being diagnosed, but also it meant that people like teachers or other professionals at that age responded to them in a way that was sort of increased authoritarianism. You need to be told what to do, rather than connecting with the terror that perhaps and fear that that individual had. And often what they felt was that they would go from one school to the next or one teacher to the next and being told, we can't deal with you. So really sort of receiving these messages that nobody could kind of handle them, nobody could deal with them. And what they described is that this left them feeling even more frightened, because not only because they couldn't contain themselves, that frightened them themselves. They often described how terrified they were afterwards, when they look back at what they'd done. In that moment, they were sometimes terrified of how they might respond. And now they were being told that, well, not only can you not control yourself, but we can't deal with you either. And what they described is that left them feeling even more frightened, that nobody would be able to protect themselves from themselves either. So this constant sort of a misunderstanding, perceptions of feeling rejected, a loss of trust in people to be able to care for them or to be able to support them. Many participants describe feeling traumatized by their experiences in the criminal justice system, and they felt that school could be this sort of pipeline to prison for some of those people. And the last theme we found then in relation to people's experiences was that life with autistic PDA was experienced as this constant battle with people in authority. And that was replicated in the relationships their parents and family members had with professionals in trying to access support as well. A large number of participants describe what this sort of constant battle, they described it as, throughout their lives, of being misunderstood by others, others responding to them in a way that wasn't as authoritarian rather than compassionate. And this disbelief led not only to difficulties for the individual themselves, but often what they described as sort of parent blaming. And parents understood that. You know, they talked about how they could see their child sometimes being like, they described it as like master manipulators. They could portray themselves as charming or using flattery in certain settings, but then perhaps when they came home or in other settings, just having these complete meltdowns because school had been so exhausting. And parents described how this often resulted in them feeling, they use the term gaslighted by professionals, that kind of idea that, well, professionals just didn't really believe them that the child was autistic because of the differences in terms of the strategies the child might adopt in different settings. And so sometimes the parent would be told it was their fault, they were too soft, or perhaps there were deficits in their parenting, and some had been threatened with legal action as well. And so they felt that this led to, for some of them, leading to this kind of constant battle between, on the one hand, themselves being passionate and resourceful, and some of them themselves noted that they were autistic as well, and intelligent and articulate, and really wanted to fight for their children on the one hand, but on the other hand, experiencing this sort of retaliation. And they described for them this battle was not only in trying to access help for their child or the person they were supporting and trying to scaffold them at the same time, but this real sort of, I suppose, juxtaposition of wanting to protect their child and themselves from professionals, but at the same time being scared of the harm their child might cause to themselves or others as well. And they summarized that in terms of saying it wasn't just a battle looking after him, it's everyone else. So I think that was one of the things that really struck us undertaking the research, was just, I suppose, the level of effort and the challenges, I suppose, that people surrounding that person experienced as well.
Yeah, and I mean, personally, just as somebody who supports many PDA individuals and their families, that really is quite hard to listen to. And I think you've really, painted a picture of how terrifying this is for autistic PDAers, and again, the associated blame that their families can experience as well.
Absolutely. And I suppose, we felt so privileged for people to have told us their stories. That was something that that really came across. Um, and I suppose in terms of our findings, we were keen to consider if part of the, I suppose, the background to the study was, well, if we want to train people, then criminal justice professionals or anybody else involved in these sort of settings, if we want to offer some training, what might be useful for them to know. So we asked participants that as well, and we looked at what factors they felt were unhelpful for autistic PDAers. I like the expression you use, who kind of come into contact with people in the criminal justice system, what was unhelpful and what was helpful. What we found was that perhaps unsurprisingly, they felt there were several factors that were unhelpful. And the first was a kind of adopting an authoritarian response worsens the situation because the person feels that it's just an attempt to control them. And that really escalates that kind of threat response. And they talked about this sort of interaction that specifically autistic people with PDA would have with criminal justice professionals that maybe people just with an autism profile wouldn't have. And they talked about this real kind of that people will have this sense to dominate in the criminal justice system. That's their role. They are given control, they have authority, but because of that, they can sometimes relate to autistic people with PDA through using power and having a lack of flexibility because they're used to just things being my way, as they said. So one of the things they talked about was that with them, the difficulty was it had been my way, no, my way, no, my way. And you'd have this constant kind of battle for control. But they described how this would then kind of level that, increase that level of threat and escalation and real desperate then exertion for control through more sort of desperate behaviours. They felt that misunderstanding the source of the behavior as being dissocial, sort of personality related, as opposed to being a response to threat, would sometimes lead to criminal justice professionals lacking compassion. So often they described that they were being told they were being badly behaved, they just needed to learn, or they just needed to get on with it. And this was experienced as people feeling really dismissed. People just didn't understand that actually the function of the behavior was around anxiety, and that then some people would engage in really extreme sort of behaviors to then try and communicate that level of threat. For some people that might be slashing their wrists, or they might be jumping onto buildings, really extreme behaviors, because the person just really didn't kind of understand that it wasn't the person just being dissocial and just not doing as they're told, that actually the function of the behavior was due to a threat. They also felt that one of the things that escalated or was kind of unhelpful was that when criminal justice professionals witnessed these extreme threat responses, their own expression of fear really escalated, and then you end up with the autistic person feeling that, well, I'm right to feel frightened then. So what they described was this kind of visual terror that almost exudes from the person. They're that terrified, it's palpable, you can physiologically feel it. And I suppose in my work with clients, I've noted that as too. That the level of terror is almost physiologically there. And what participants described was this sort of mirror neurons, the idea that almost you mirror the kind of experiences that are in front of you. And so what they talked about was that sometimes the individual would be terrified, then the police or a teacher or some criminal justice professional would have contact with them, and they would experience that terror, and then they would feel terrified too. And then when the individual saw the police person or whoever it was being terrified, they then became even more frightened because they thought, you don't know how to deal with me, like what's going to happen. So they ended up in this real kind of escalating cycle of terror, where both mirror neurons were kind of feeding off each other. So that was something that seemed to be quite unique in terms of kind of the autistic PDA experience as opposed to people without PDA. So we asked them what they felt would be helpful, and participants said that adopting a warm and compassionate approach and to explain boundaries in an intelligent way that helps the person to reduce their levels of threat would be helpful. So what they described was that it wasn't that people shouldn't adhere to boundaries, or they shouldn't do sometimes things that are being asked of them. But it's if somebody can explain that in a warm and compassionate way, that can help to build trust. And they talked about people kind of flexing their authority, almost like flexing a muscle, but flexing this authority is really kind of unhelpful. Whereas if somebody can explain in a kind of articulate and logical way why the request they're making may be something for that person to consider, then they feel that would be really helpful. They felt that criminal justice professionals who listened and didn't always feel that they had to be right reduced that sort of level of battle. And I should add that, you know, a number of participants did talk about positive interactions they'd had with criminal justice professionals too. They felt that those some of the people that were really helpful were those that had had experience of people with autism in their families. They'd had specific training on autistic individuals, or just generally adopted a warm and compassionate manner, as opposed to one where their only repertoire in their toolkit almost was authority. So they felt when people had a range of strategies to use and maybe lived experience of some of those things, that was really helpful. And they said that it would be really helpful for people to understand that autism comes in many forms, that obviously people may be used to the more traditional kind of narratives that we've learned around autism symptoms, but understanding that those might come in different forms and responding in a kind of low arousal, sort of low threat response can help to reduce the levels of anxiety in that person. So they felt that it would be really helpful for us to deliver training, and I'll explain a little bit at the end, I suppose, about our recommendations for that. But participants really wanted people to have training to understand those things and how they might respond in a way to reduce the behaviour escalating. They felt that specifically this related to understanding that autistic people with PDA maybe do have eye contact, they can sometimes read the room, and they may adopt more intellectual challenges, would be helpful for people to understand, and to really understand the function of that behaviour as being threat related. So people felt that would be helpful. They also really talked about a systems approach to supporting autistic PDAs to provide a more holistic response to their needs and reduce the likelihood of contact with the criminal justice system. So one of the things they really talked about was that often the person would only have contact with criminal justice professionals when they were in an escalated kind of a threat response. And they felt that actually it would be helpful sometimes for that person to have contact with those professionals when they were at baseline, perhaps when they weren't so heightened in their response, so that they could, that everybody could get to understand that individual. And they really wanted a multidisciplinary sort of response. So linking in with social work, family liaison, mental health teams, and not this kind of binary view, I suppose, that we have sometimes, and we see this in other settings too, around mental health support being very separate to autism support, and sometimes those services being separated, and that was something they really struggled with in terms of autistic PDA, because they felt that a lot of the mental health support they needed related to trauma, and particularly they talked about the trauma of how they experienced response from criminal justice professionals, their experiences of education as well, and that often then that contributed towards their perceptions of threat. Family members also talked about how they felt they would like more aftercare, after incidents, so kind of follow-up care. And they felt that sometimes it impacted on their own mental health as well. Sometimes they might struggle to get into employment, or they might struggle to financially, as a result as well, because it might be difficult for anybody else to support their child or the person they were supporting because of the levels of extreme behaviour. And then obviously they were then sort of wrestling with trying to support the child themselves, getting help themselves as a family member, and many of them talked about how that had impacted on their mental health. So they felt that that would be really helpful. And in terms of therapy, they also felt the interventions for people with autistic and PDA could be adapted to take into account that specific profile. So they talked about how some of them might have been offered therapies such as cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a really, really good intervention for anxiety. It's got a really good evidence base. It's got a set number of sessions, but obviously those kind of things can act as barriers for people with PDA. So they talked about sometimes they could be removed from therapy or waiting lists because they didn't attend the sessions they were told to, or they felt that this sort of demand for only 10 sessions was very difficult for them. So it was almost like the very symptoms of PDA made accessing therapy very difficult as well. And CBT requires people to kind of face your fear. So if you're frightened of something that's unreasonable, so you should approach it. So if you're frightened of public speaking because you think people will judge you, the more public speaking you do, the more you realize that actually it's okay. And so it's approach something you're frightened of rather than avoid. But participants described how for them this was just absolute terror. It wasn't just anxiety, it was absolute trauma and terror. And they said, well, you wouldn't ask a victim of sexual abuse to face their abuser. They felt that the CBT approach was perhaps not always helpful for them, and made things worse. And what they wanted was therapy that would enhance this sense of safety, so more trauma-informed approach, to enhance these feelings of safety, and reminding therapists that perhaps the difficulties are slightly different. So that was really interesting to hear that some people struggle to access therapy to support them with their needs because of the very symptoms they presented with.
Yeah, and I guess as well, what we hear is that CBT, can be really helpful for PDAs, but a lot of it depends on the relationship with the therapist and that level of rapport and the level of trust. So it might work with one therapist, but not with another, depending on their understanding of PDA and their flexibility in their approaches as well.
Absolutely, definitely, and that's certainly what participants talked about as well. They said that the therapists that could be more flexible in terms of understanding those needs, understanding the functions of those behaviours, was very, very important. And it's that building relationships. There was a lot that participants talked about that trust is really, really important, and building those relationships is kind of pivotal for any of those sort of changes.
Yeah.
So in study 2 then, this is where we talked to the criminal justice professionals and got their point of view. And we asked them what knowledge did they have about autistic PDA. The first theme was that they felt that autistic people with PDA in the criminal justice system can be really violent, was the expression that was sort of used. So there was something about them almost mirroring that understanding, I suppose, about them feeling that perhaps they were more violent, I suppose, than people with just autistic features alone. And they felt that this would resulted in these clients being more likely to be placed in seclusion in forensic settings, and more likely to require physical restraint, and more likely to require physical interventions. So they noted that potential capacity for violence as well. The second theme was they felt that some participants felt that autistic people with PDA purposely antisocial, defiant, and break rules. So there was this perception from participants that they would challenge authority, and they would breach court orders, they would not conform to instructions, and when asked the sort of origins of that, most people felt that it related to the person's personality rather than autistic features. Sometimes terms like psychopath were used, and they felt that the individuals were more likely to breach orders that were placed upon them as well, and have higher levels of punishment or sentencing. So there was a real theme there about perception of these sort of behaviours being driven by antisocial behaviour and personality. And then the third theme related to they wanting training, I suppose, in terms of how to support a person with PDA. Half of the sample said they'd not even heard of PDA. Only 5 had received specific training on PDA. And as I said, we suspect that's a lot higher than would be expected in the general population of criminal justice professionals, because obviously the study was advertised on the PDA website. 27 participants had no training in PDA at all. 12 of them thought that PDA was a form of autism, but they didn't really know what PDA was. And many of them thought that PDA was some sort of mental health problem or a personality problem as well. So there was a real lack of understanding about what PDA was, but there was a real keenness from criminal justice professionals to understand that. So they did want more training to understand in what ways they might support someone with PDA. So those are the findings from the second study.
Lovely. And I guess, you'd already got a very good understanding of PDA. Was there anything that surprised you out of either of the studies?
Yeah, and I suppose obviously as a researcher, it's really important that we try to separate the lens that we're analyzing the research through. I suppose it's a double-edged sword in the sense that it's obviously I'm really fortunate that I have lots of training in autism. I undertake autistic assessments, and I've had lots of additional training in PDA, and I've been really fortunate to work with lots of autistic clients and those with PDA. So that's really helpful on the one sense, because it helps me to have that kind of lens, I suppose, through which I might be able to hear some of those stories that people have been able to give. But we also have to bear in mind that the narrative that I bring may be different to the narratives that other people bring. We try, obviously, as part of our thematic analysis, to be really reflexive and really think about our positioning as a researcher and perhaps what we bring to that. So as part of that, obviously we think about I guess it's really important to listen to the stories that people tell us and not just what we bring. But I did think it was helpful in terms of, particularly, obviously my PhD was trying to understand why staff might not always be as compassionate as we might like them to be, and why sometimes working with clients in forensic settings can be really challenging. And most people who come into those job roles come into it for really good reasons, that they want to help, they want to do good by society, they want to do good things. So I try to hold that lens as well, I suppose, when trying to hear the criminal justice system professionals' experiences. I think the thing that struck me most was, as a researcher, was certainly how powerful it was that the family members and the challenges that people had gone through, that kind of constant battle, the resiliency, I suppose, that those people brought was phenomenal. And that really came across, that they'd really had to battle very hard for themselves and for other people, and that was really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, lots of findings there. And I mean, where do you start? What were your recommendations based on those findings?
Well, I suppose there were two sort of things from a psychological perspective that we noted, particularly really thinking about how autistic PDA might differ in terms of their contact in the criminal justice system compared to autism alone. And one of the things we really found was these reciprocal roles that they might get into with people in the criminal justice system. And I guess suppose what that related to was having the individual really bringing with them a huge fear of a lack of a personal autonomy or control. And that led them to having this sort of anticipatory anxiety and a heightened state of alert, sort of really looking out for kind of increased subtle changes in the environment, who might pose a threat, this sort of constant radar, I suppose, for threats to that autonomy and control. And what we saw in those individuals is that they sometimes might engage in these kind of safety behaviors to try and achieve control. That might be charm, negotiation, or manipulation. But when they felt really controlled, that could make them feel adopt more defiant sort of aggression kind of responses. And when that person was then tried to be controlled by a criminal justice professional, that then led to them trying to get more control. So it kind of then a heightened sense of terror and heightened fight or flight and a heightened need for control. So it was this escalating sort of cycle. But one of the things that we noted was actually that it's a very similar thing that the criminal justice system person is experiencing as well. You know, they come into their job, if we think of the police, they come into their job role often with a sense of a requirement for personal autonomy or control. If they don't have that, society can go quite wrong. They might also have this heightened kind of threat system where they're constantly on the lookout for subtle changes in the environment, who might pose a threat, and this need for control. And obviously, when people threaten somebody's need for control, who say is a police person, they likely respond with increased control. And you know, if somebody opposes that, they're likely to become ready to fight or flight to regain that control. So what we saw was that actually the autistic individual with PDA and the criminal justice system professional have very similar patterns in terms of those sort of needs for control. But obviously when those two match, that's when you get that real clash. And that was the thing that we saw that we felt really escalated for some of these clients, that situation, because of the very nature of the kind of criminal justice system sort of professional's role. And I guess the second thing we found from a psychological point of view was, I suppose, the real subtle differences between dissocial sort of personality styles and autistic PDA, and that sometimes those things could look quite similar. Obviously, it's really important to note that and I should have said this at the beginning, so excuse me, you know, we know that the majority of autistic people do not engage in offending behavior, and lots of autistic people with PDA don't engage in offending behavior either. But for those that do, then obviously we need to look at how those people might be supported. We also know that some people might have autistic PDA and dissocial personality features. So some people might have both of those things. And it's really important from a criminal justice setting that when we're determining those things, that we have a kind of qualified healthcare professional to decide, well, where one starts and where the other ends. And participants were really, really clear that they didn't want to apportion blame on their behavior as a result of being autistic. And I think that is really important, that obviously factors might contribute towards some of those difficulties and aggression responses. But participants were really keen that they wanted support for those things. They didn't want aggressive behavior to be excused in any way. There was at no point were they saying that was okay. So it's really important that as professionals, when we're trying to support clients who are engaging in kind of behaviours that might result in contact with the criminal justice system, that we try to have a really comprehensive formulation to understand what aspects are autism, what aspects are PDA, what aspects of the person's personality, their own sort of personality style. But what's really important is that criminal justice system professionals hold on to that for some individuals, those responses are as a result of intense terror and threat and fear, and not because they purposely want to defy that person or purposely be rude or be violent. So we created sort of some guidance, I suppose, in terms of where some of those features might overlap and where they're different. So in terms of recommendations, obviously we recommended training, and we felt that professionals who have contact with autistic people with PDA could have training in terms of the differences between autism and autistic PDA, what that might look like, what the differences are between oppositional defiance and kind of conduct disorder. So those are things that we might see in young children who just say no, just don't want to conform, who just kind of break the rules or don't want to do as they're told, but for reasons that are aside from autistic PDA. So those are because they're anti-authoritarian, they are oppositional, they just don't agree with social rules generally, they might have more immoral beliefs, whereas autistic PDA is sort of defying rules or not adhering to rules because of terror and fear. So we felt that professionals would be helpful for them to understand the differences between those two things and to really understand the function of behaviour and how to respond in those settings. We really felt that we needed to adopt more trauma-informed approaches in education, therapy and criminal justice settings generally, to really acknowledge that level of trauma that those people may bring and how we respond to that. And understanding that kind of the way that the person's those fight or flight responses in which the body might kind of mirror some of the physiological responses to others can sometimes escalate situations. So if we can teach criminal justice system professionals to have like low arousal, so sort of in other words, even though you might feel really terrified that somebody's really quite frightening in front of you, how do you present in a low arousal state, how do you try to contain your response in that situation to try and keep things calm, and low expressed emotion. So teaching people those things could be really helpful to reduce that escalation and that kind of cycle that we see. And really thinking about how do we communicate with that person to help them make choices in a way that's best for them. So almost in an intellectual way, being able to explain why we might be asking someone to do something, or what why they might want to consider and what their options are, and doing that in a way that's intellectually sort of considered, and not assuming authority. So in other words, giving people like another sort of string in their bow, or another kind of tool in their kit, that if you're telling someone to do something that's not just working, like, well, what else might you want to use? I suppose in a way that we might do with parents, as children move from childhood to adolescence, they have to shift their strategies, that you can't just sort of, you can't tell a 14-year-old to just do something. You have to be a little bit more intellectually sort of challenging and think, well, how do I explain that to make them, think it might be a good idea? So I suppose it's sort of teaching criminal justice system professionals strategies a little bit like that. And then, the other recommendations were just around this kind of multidisciplinary working. So improving access to psychological services for autistic people with PDA, which included mental health needs and not just kind of strategies in relation to autism. Really supporting the amount of access to support the family members and carers can get as well, which acknowledges the increased and large levels of stress that might bring to them as well. We also recommended having a more reflective space, I suppose, for teams supporting autistic people with PDA, where everybody could reflect. So whether that's social workers, psychiatrists, teachers, police, the family member, but having this real reflective space where everybody could reflect there together in a non-judgmental way about what it's like to support that individual, and acknowledging that sometimes it could be frightening, sometimes it can be frustrating when people don't do as we want them to, what that feels like, and then agreeing together how to respond in a way that's helpful for that person as well. And obviously, if the individuals of age, they can be involved in those discussions as well, but really working in that kind of supportive, reflective space so that all voices can be heard equally on their experiences supporting that person. And then really thinking about making sure that we have follow-up contact for for the autistic person and their family following that contact with the criminal justice system, given that could have been quite traumatizing and contribute towards subsequent difficulties. And as I think you've already psychically mentioned already, in terms of the interventions for autistic people with PDA in terms of therapy, and we have talked about, we made recommendations that we felt it'd be helpful for them to have more time built into sessions for rapport building. So often with CBT, it might be, say, a set number of sessions, say 10 or 12 sessions, and the therapist might not really be allowed to kind of go over that. They're quite prescribed sessions in terms of the content, but we've suggested that for autistic people with PDA, it would be good for that to factor in that additional time for rapport building, because as you so rightly said, that is imperative in terms of supporting the person to commence therapy. It might mean that they need additional sessions for that. For therapists and practitioners to have understanding specifically around autistic PDA. Lots of therapists and people have had training, I suppose, in terms of autism, but understanding what those additional PDA features might look like and would be really helpful as well. And specifically helping them to understand that the provision of therapy can in itself act as a demand. It's like another demand placed on that person. So understanding that and really using these kind of compassionate and more trauma-informed approaches. So yeah, that's what we recommended.
Wow, gosh, that is fascinating. It really is. And yeah, I mean, obviously working for the PDA Society, it's so exciting to actually have some research now to be able to share with professionals. So, thank you so much. It's been absolutely brilliant. I guess I've got two further questions. And, what are the next steps now for your research?
So I suppose the first step is obviously to share it. We've shared it with you first as the most important audience, I suppose, in terms of the recognition, I suppose, of the gratitude that we had for everybody that's taken part. So what we hope now to do is to obviously begin to share that in sort of more formal places. So peer-reviewed journals, conferences. We're attending a conference in September time for criminal justice professionals, beginning to share that with them, and being able to think about how we can help people to hear these voices, and to think about what we can do on a practical basis. I know the PDA Society, as we've talked about, what that might look like in terms of how we might adapt training for people. And I suppose it's really understanding in a kind of compassionate way. I suppose we understand from this why criminal justice system professionals might respond in the way they do to this sort of client group, and sort of understanding that and understanding why they might do that, but maybe supporting them to do that in alternative ways could be helpful for everybody. So the future steps would be definitely to share the findings more widely, and to be able to really make kind of practical changes. I always think research is wonderful, but it needs to have an impact, and we hope that the findings will be able to share those with people to make that impact, so that people's experiences improve.
Okay, so thank you, Rachel. That has been absolutely, well, I'm running out of adjectives really to describe it. I've got so many thoughts going on in my head, but it's just been absolutely invaluable. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of what I know will be a very busy schedule to share this research with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I just want to reiterate thank you to all the participants that took the time to share their story. We feel incredibly privileged that people have taken the time to do that. And we hope that the research has a positive impact for people. And I suppose just to bear in mind that we know that hearing these things can be difficult. Sometimes it can resonate with experiences that other people may have had that haven't been involved as well. So I suppose it's just to reiterate, if anybody's having any difficulties, I know that the PDA Society, I know you do amazing work, and I know that they can contact you if somebody's struggling, if this is perhaps brought up difficulties for the person that they'd like some support with, then I know that you're a really useful resource in terms of being able to access support as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Our support service is available, and I'll pop the address or the email address for the support service in the show notes as well, if anybody would like to access that. So thanks again, Rachel. It's been absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this podcast, please do contact our support service. You can see the link on the screen there. And if you have any further questions about the actual research itself, please email training@pdasociety.org.uk. Thank you.